So welcome back. Today we're going to start with doing some analysis. And this is an awesome piece by Clara Schumann. We're going to listen to it first because we do want to connect our ear with our theory. And then we're going to talk about analyzing the non-chord tones in this piece. And we'll find that just a few non-chord tones make all the difference in really creating an amazing piece of music. So let's listen first. So this is a little bit more advanced theoretically than what we've covered so far. There's a few things in here. So you'll notice this 5-6 chord in parentheses along with this 4-6, 3-6, 2-6. Those are in parentheses because they are considered non-functional harmony. And what that means is the notes line up to create that chord, but it doesn't follow that harmonic progression chart that we've talked about before, and it doesn't, and so they don't have the same gravitational pull that they normally would. There's some other factor that makes them non-functional, and in this case, it's use of parallel first inversion triads. So we're going from 5, 4, 3, 2. So we're just going down parallel first inversion triads, and that's a technique you can use that overrides the harmonic progression, the expectation for what chords would go to which chord following. So that would be considered non-functional harmony. There's a few things in here that we haven't covered, but most of it, especially this opening 4 measures, is something that you could conceivably write on your own. You could compose something as amazing as Clara Schumann. So looking at our first measure, our key is F major, it's a 1 chord. We see that in the left hand we have F and C, which is it's an open 5th, and then very quickly we arpeggiate the rest of the chord. In the right hand, we start on the 3rd of the chord, we then jump down to an E. That E is not part of the chord. It immediately resolves up. It ends up being on a strong beat, on beat 4, prepared by leap and resolved by step. That is the non-chord tone Appoggiatura. So we have an Appoggiatura right up there on beat 4. So I'm going to write over here, just so that we have it, APP, so that we know that we have an Appoggiatura in the first measure in the right hand of the piano. What's interesting is trying to determine exactly when the chord changes, because rhythmically these chords are starting on the end of 1. It's a little unusual. So we have an A on the downbeat of measure 2 in the right hand in our melody, and you could say, well, it's the 3rd of our 1 chord, but what's coming up next is a 2 chord. So it's going to be a non-chord tone in the 2 chord. Well, it's approached by leap, then F to A is a leap and resolved by step. So it's another Appoggiatura. Also, when we look at that, we see that the notes for our 2 chord would be G, B flat, and D. I wrote them right here. There's a D, G, B flat, D, but there's an F here. That F is not in the chord. We're not talking about a 2-7 chord. and in this case it would be a 2-4-2. That's not the way it's been labeled. That's not the way that F functions. How does it function? Well, to do that, I'm going to look back here to this F. And I'm going to look forward to this F. And I'll notice that in this 5-7 chord, that F is not a chord tone. Well, what could it be where you have an F being played over and over and the lowest note being heard? It's a pedal tone. So we actually have the F pedal that goes from the 1 chord to the 1 chord. And actually, you could say all the way to this 1 chord here where you hear the F again. So down in the bass, that F is a pedal. What's interesting is sometimes pedal tones are whole notes or longer note values. Here, it's a little bit deceiving because it looks like it's just an eighth note. But when you play a low note, the human ear will hear that continuing. It'll kind of like sustain in the ear, even if it's not being sustained on the piano. Other notes in the second measure, we see an F sharp. So F sharp is definitely not part of our 2 chord. It's prepared by step down, so G down to the F sharp, and then step back up. So that would make it a neighbor tone. We'll notice that it's an accented neighbor tone, and that it's a chromatic neighbor tone. And in one of our earlier times, we did talk about diatonic versus chromatic non-chord tones. And I mentioned that both are possible. Diatonic are more common. But here's a great example of how you could use a chromatic neighbor tone. That F sharp is not in the key signature. Let's move forward to our third measure. We have a similar beat 1 to what we had here, where we have A here, we have a D over here in our third measure. That D is a non-chord tone for our C7. Our C7 would be the notes C, E, G, B flat. So that D is prepared and approached by leap up and then resolved down by step. That is an appoggiatura. So we can see in this example, the appoggiatura is not just randomly thrown in as a one-off, but it is actually a structural component of the composition. So the non-chord tones aren't just some little extra that are thrown in. They're developed, they're expanded upon, they're an integral part of the overall composition. D in the top melody, appoggiatura, another pedal tone here, that F in the left hand. We then see the E, G, C, G, B flat, C, B flat, all of those, and then a 1 chord here, A, C, A. You could ask yourself, how come they call this a 1 chord and not a 1-6? Because if we look at the lowest note on beat 3, it's an A. If you stop and think about it for a second, there's a good reason why they're calling it a 1 chord and not 1-6. The answer is F, 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 F. What I said a moment ago about how the human ear will kind of sustain that lowest note. So even if you play a low note and then arpeggiate up, that low note that you played earlier on is still heard as the bass of what's happening at that moment. So that still is really a 1 chord root position because of the pedal and the way that sustains through. If we look at if we ignore the grace note for a moment and say, well, let's look at the D on beat 4 in our melody in our right hand, that is from the C up to a D, back to a C. So that D without the grace note is a neighbor tone. The grace note is simply an embellishment of that neighbor tone. You could say, well, the grace note is a leap up, resolved down by step, so it's like an appoggiatura. It has a similar shape as the appoggiatura. So the C up to the E, down to the D, and then you would analyze the D. You could say, well, if I look at the shape there, E, D, C, that's kind of like a passing tone. I think the most insightful analysis, though, is to call the D a neighbor tone and the E an embellishment, a grace note embellishment above that. But that's something that you could debate. Moving on to our fourth measure, we finally have that pedal resolve. And there we get a nice example of a 1-chord arpeggiation. We then have our 5/6 chord. We have that D again at the and a 4 at the very end of the measure. This time without the grace note, which is another reason why I think that it really should be analyzed as a neighbor tone and not taking that E grace note into consideration, because when it's repeated, you don't have that. So neighbor tone, right at the end of the fourth measure. If we come down here, we move to our 4/6 chord. Our 4/6 in the key of F major, form chord is B flat, D, F. So we look and say, well, that C is definitely is not part of that chord. Either is the A. So neither of these, but F, B flat, D's, F, B flat, D, all of those are. So what are we going to do about those, the A and the C? Well, it is probably easiest to say, this one's a little tricky. If we don't look ahead of time to the D and just look at that, it's resolving here to the B flat. It's a note above, it's a note below. That looks to me like a neighbor group. That said, if I was expecting a true neighbor group, it would be a B flat that would precede it, but I don't have that. So what else could it be? Well, if you remember, one of the challenges here was that rhythmic construction where the harmony comes in on the and of a beat. So, from a certain way of looking at it, you could say, well, this 4/6 chord doesn't start until the and of 1. In which case, your ear is still hearing the 5/6 chord. If that's the case, this C is a chord tone belonging to the 5/6 chord. Our 4/6 doesn't start to hear. If that's the case, then this A is prepared by leap and resolved by step in the opposite direction. You could call it an appoggiatura. And I think that's probably the most accurate analysis of that spot. Let me get our video back here. So we're going to call that the C a chord tone. That is, the C will be considered a chord tone. That is a kind of a continuation of the 5/6 chord in the previous measure. And that the 4/6 chord actually occurs here on the and of 1, the A being an appoggiatura. Then we go to a 3/6 chord. Remember what I've said, what we've talked about in the past. 3 chords, when they are functional, are in root position. You almost never have a 3 chord in any kind of inversion. So the fact that we have it is another clue that this is a non-functional harmony. So our 3 chord in the key of F major would be A, C, E. So we have all those notes. We got our C's, E, A. A is here as well. This A comes in on the and of 3. And it looks like the chord actually changes on on beat 4. So with that, you could say this A here is not part of the B flat major triad, but it's anticipating what's coming up. So we would label this A an anticipation. This B flat is not part of the A minor triad. It is a passing tone. You will notice that the overwhelming majority of the non-chord tones are in the upper voice, in the melody. And that is not uncommon. We then get to our 2/6 chord. G, B flat, D are our notes. We have that similar question. This A probably belongs to the 3/6 chord. This D does not. And this is a little tricky because of the way it's written. On beat 1, this D is a non-chord tone. On the and of 1, it's a chord tone. So the first eighth note of this D would be considered an anticipation. There's an example of a non-chord tone that's not in the melody. So you do have them in other voices, but it's less common. We then have our B flat, D, G, D, G. Here's an F. That's not part of our chord, but it looks very similar to this, and it functions the same way. So the F here is an anticipation to a F major triad, where we have A, C, C, F, and then an arpeggio of that chord. We move on to the 5-4-3, and after this we're not going to analyze any further because it has some chords that we haven't covered and we're not ready to cover yet. So this is actually very sophisticated in the sense that when the chord changes, the harmonic rhythm, it's not always on the downbeat. It doesn't sound that way. So some of the notes that are on downbeats, like this C, you can kind of debate whether it belongs to the 5/6 preceding or to the 4/6 ahead of time. But regardless of what you decide, you're going to look at how the note is prepared and how the notes are resolved to determine whether it's a chord tone or a non-chord tone. And the reason we listen to it first is so that sometimes your ear will tell you whether it's a chord tone or a non-chord tone. Some notes will sound like they're a dissonance. If they sound like a dissonance, they're probably a non-chord tone. If they sound like they belong to the chord, then they're chord tones. So as you're doing an analysis, do not neglect to listen to the music and use your ear to help you with your analysis. Great. So now, let's move forward to another example. I'm going to turn on some extra lights here. I have an example here on the board of a 4-part soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Very simple. And what I would like to do is go over how you could add non-chord tones to this to make it much more interesting. Okay? So step 1, if you are asked to do something like this, is analyze what you have. So, it's either an F major or D minor. F, A, C, F. That's an F major triad, so I'm leaning towards F major. I see no C sharps, which would be the raised leading tone in D minor. That's another clue. And it ends F, F, A, F. Well, that's a tripled root and a third F major triad. We are most certainly in F major. So F, A, C, F, F major triad, that is a 1 chord. E, C, C, G, that is a C major triad. with E in the bass. So that would be a 5/6 chord. F, C, F, A, that is an F major triad in root position. C, C, E, G, that is a C major triad in root position. D, A, D, F, that is a D minor triad in root position. B flat, G, D, B flat, that is a G minor triad with B flat in the bass. So that would be a 2/6 chord. C, E, C, G, that is a C major triad in root position. C, G, C, E, another C major triad in root position. We already said 3 Fs and an A, so tripled root and a third is an F major triad. So I've analyzed my chords. I've even included lead sheet symbols. Now let's listen to what that sounds like. Again, we want to use our ear to help our theory. We want to develop both of these. So, so that sounds very nice. All the harmonies, everything is functional harmony here. 1/5, lots of 1/5. We have one deceptive resolution. You'll notice that it does not include our normal doubling for a 6th chord. That is part of the deceptive resolution. It has the doubled root, but this steps up. All the upper voices move in contrary motion, such that we don't have any parallel fifths. We avoid that issue. So one deceptive resolution, 6, 2, 5, 5, 1. So very traditional harmonic progression, works great. How can we make this more interesting? Let's add some non-chord tones. So we want to think about having some passing tones, a neighbor tone, a suspension, a retardation, Appoggiatura, an escape tone, maybe a neighbor group, maybe a pedal point, anticipation. Let's see if we can get one of each of these in the example. So, retardations often happen at the very end of a piece. So that's where I'm going to go right off the bat. Soprano is the most obvious place to put it, so let me put it back here and talk you through it. I want to put a retardation right at the end. I'm going to take this E, I'm going to carry it over. So I'm going to erase that. I'm going to put an E quarter note. That'll be a nice dissonance that I will then resolve up. Since I got 2 of those roots already, I'm going to mess with this 3rd one. So then I would circle this, and actually I'm going to circle in a different color, so it stands out. So we are going to label this right here is our retardation. And we can check that off the list. We got one. Good. The next thing I want to do is I want to say, okay, let me look for a place to have a passing tone. And passing tones are great in the bass. So I look for a leap of a third. Well, here's a leap of a third right here. So I take this D, I turn it into a quarter note, I add another quarter note here on beat 2. So now that's C, I circle it, I'll label it PT for passing tones. This is a really good one too, because it's great when you have the root and it moves down to what would be the seventh. So your root just drops and goes down. That's a really effective use of the passing tone. And it creates a nice dissonance against the doubled root up here. So good. Got a passing tone taken care of. How about my neighbor group? That's a little challenging. So a neighbor group means I want to have a note. I'm looking for two notes that are common. What about right here? I have a C and a C. And what I want is I want to have neighbor, upper neighbor and lower neighbor. So here's a C. I'll make that into a quarter note. I'll start with my upper neighbor, D, B. Oh, let me do that correctly. That's not how you write a B. B, and make these eighth notes. And then I can circle that and label this my neighbor group. All right, what do I want to do next? Let's see. How about an appoggiatura? Appoggiaturas are great in the soprano, as we saw in our example that we analyzed. So this is a nice point. This is the high point of our melody. This is our focal point. It's prepared by a leap. Let's make that even more prominent. Let's make that even more prominent. Let's jump. Instead of to that B, let's jump all the way up to a C. And then step back to the B flat. So when you put again, appoggiaturas are on strong beat, typically, and they bring attention, they draw attention to that, because they stand out as the dissonance. So that's going to be particularly dramatic. It's going to be a super focal point. And then we got our appoggiatura. Then I would love to have a suspension. Suspension, we're looking for a step down. And let's see if we can find a spot. I'd love to have the alto have something. So is there a good spot for the alto? This would be a step down, but I don't want to do it here because I already have a passing tone here. So if I do a suspension here and then put it here, put the resolution here, that means on beat 2, there's another non-chord tone here. So let me slow down and say that a little clearer. If I were to put a suspension on beat 1, that would mean on beat 1, you do not hear the 6th chord clearly with just the notes that are in a 6th chord. It would then resolve in the alto suspension on beat 2. The problem is on beat 2, you still would not hear that 6th chord without any other pitches involved because I have a passing tone here. And that makes things a little murkier and sometimes problematic. You can do that in certain circumstances, but not all. So I would like to avoid that kind of issue. So how about a step down right here? This would work. It'll be the only non-chord tone. There will be no interference. So I'm going to take this C. Anytime I have a non-chord tone that falls on a strong beat, I have to erase the note that's there because I'm going to move it over. So I have to erase this C, replace it with a D on beat 1, and then on beat 2, we actually get our unadulterated 5 chord. I'll then circle that and label it suspension. So now I've got tenor gets a non-chord tones, bass has soprano, alto, back to the soprano, and I now have non-chord tones in every measure except the first measure. So let's take a look and see what we could put in our first measure that would work well. We could do a neighbor tone, and that would work really well right there. So let's just make that happen. C, D, back to C, circle it. Let's label it NT for neighbor tone. I'm looking for an escape tone, a pedal point, and anticipation. Pedal points are definitely the most difficult and challenging to put in. And we might not find a spot for that in this example. So I'm going to put that on hold. I would like to find an anticipation. Anticipation usually happens at some kind of cadential point. This is a deceptive cadence. I already have my retardation at my authentic cadence. So let's see if I could put a anticipation. Works great in the soprano, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn that into a G. They're often dotted note values for anticipations. So instead of doing quarter notes, I'm going to do a dotted quarter eighth note. A-N-T for anticipation. So we got that one taken care of. Lastly, I want an escape tone. Here, I'm now going to start looking at the overall composite rhythm of my half notes combined with my non-chord tones. Because I want to keep the rhythmic motion moving forward. So quarter note, this thing slow down right here. So this is a great spot. If I can put in some kind of quarter note in here, I'd love to do that. Quarter, eighths, dotted, quarter, eighth, quarter. Things slow down right here. So those are two spots that I would like to keep the rhythmic motion. Good. And before we get too far ahead, let's make sure we label our suspension. So, from the bass to the suspension, C to D, that is a 9. C to C, that's an 8. So 9/8 suspension. All right. So, can we put an escape tone somewhere in here? We just had something in the alto. We could put this E could go down to an F. A D. So E, D, jump up to the F. I don't think I want to do that because the E is the leading tone. It likes to just resolve up to the F. I don't know if I want to mess with that. We could have this C could move down to a B and then jump up to the F. But I don't want to do that because when you hear a B, it makes it sound like the 7th of the chord, and the 7th of chords like to resolve down. This G could go to the F and then leap up. I think that's my best bet. So I think that's what I'll do. I'll take this G, step down to the F, and then leap up as my resolution, and that'll be my escape tone. I'm going to want to put something here just to keep things moving, or maybe I don't. No, I do. I'm going to take this, I'm going to keep it moving. I'm going to go C to a B flat. It could be analyzed as a 5/7 chord or a passing tone. So I have two passing tones now. Passing tones are one of the most common non-chord tone. And I have my motion moving forward. In terms of pedal points, I'd have to really erase a lot to kind of keep then it's almost like you have a 3-voice texture over a pedal tone. And so that's something that's a different challenge that we're going to save for another time. So now let's listen to what we've come up with. So we're going to do it nice and slow, out of time, so we can really hear everything here. So. That is certainly a very different piece than what we started with. And I really like the way that turned out. That ends up being very effective. Some of them are more effective than others. Some of them, and so again, you always want to use your ear to really determine whether it's giving the right flavor. But from a theoretic standpoint, all of this is going to work, and it works. It sounds good. That's what works means. It's going to sound good. Whether it captures exactly what you want, that becomes another question. That's where definitely using your ear comes into play. So, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the creativity involved in adding non-chord tones to something that's simple. And don't be afraid to add non-chord tones on lots of stuff. That's what the Baroque era was all about, embellishments. And those embellishments and ornamentation are essentially a textbook on how to use non-chord tones.